Welcome friends to the online course on HSC practices in offshore and petroleum engineering run under NPTEL braces at IIT Madras. We are talking about the lectures on module 2. Module 2 lectures are focused on operational safety. This lecture is titled lecture 6. We are going to talk about risk assessment. Let us say 1 because I will talk about risk assessment in many lectures later. We will talk about the first series of these lectures. If you recollect what we saw in the last lecture, let us slightly rewind back and see. We said risk can be expressed mathematically as actually the sum of events or accident sequences. Sum it over I, where PICI will be taken as the product of PICI is taken as risk, where Pi is the probability of accidents or occurrence of accidents. Please understand, when I am including certain accidents which is going to count for the risk, then these accidents are above the LRP level, because in offshore industry we have something called risk acceptance level. So, those accidents which are above the acceptance level are only recorded here, and Ci is the consequence of each accident, where I will be the sum, will be summed up over the number of incidents. So, we already said that this particular equation 1 is able to give the statistical lookout for the risk definition. So, equation 1 gives the statistical lookout . Mathematically this is fine, because this is giving me the probability of occurrence, it is also giving me the consequence. The product of this is what we say risk is perfectly fine mathematically. But what is missing in this whole equation, which as an offshore engineer we are feeling important, is the value in practice. The moment I say value in practice, I am looking forward for an economical perspective of this particular risk, because that is what is going to affect my industry in the whole. Now, the interesting argument of equation 1, if you look at this in detail by giving an example, you will know the seriousness of using this equation for understanding risk as an offshore engineer. For a mathematician, this equation is fine. But let us give an example and try to understand what actually we are missing through this equation as an offshore engineer. If the accident rates are rare, it is very good to know that accident rates in offshore industries are rare, because of various precautionary measures taken by the industry, various stringent safety norms followed by the organizations and companies, various rules and regulations imposed by the local government on production exploitation on the industries, and of course, intensive dedicated training offered by the company to their employees to ensure and to practice safety. Thanks to all people who are involved in safety group in inculcating safety culture in offshore industry, hats off to all of them. But however, we can always proudly say my industry has got a very rare accident rate. So, the moment you have a rare accident rate, then mathematically it is accepted that an average value is usually assumed. Because the number of accident rates spread over a specific number of years is very less, then you look for an average. The moment you look for an average over a long period will yield low annual values, this we already know. Let us take an example. Let us say, for example, in 50 years, only 6 major accidents are reported. I am very careful in writing the statement in block letters. There are many near miss events, there are many accidents which remain unreported, non-documented. Therefore, let us say there are only 6 major accidents reported, which said there are only 10 fatalities over the period of 10 years. Over a period of 50 years. During this period of consideration, there are only 10 fatalities. It is good to know that there are no fatalities. So, remember, this particular statement taken as an example accounts only for human loss of life. It does not account for an economic loss where the machinery was burnt, where the platform was completely fired and exploded off. We are not looking into all those things, where this statement says there were only 10 fatalities on the reported accidents for the past 50 years, which means 0.2 fatality per year. So, looking at this number, one will understand that the accident rates are very, very low and the fatality number is very minimum. Therefore, we are following very healthy safety practices in offshore industry. As I said, risk is a term associated and should be associated with economics. I must look into the loss. Consequences should not only address the loss of life, it should also address the loss of economic value which has been occurred or resulted from these accidents which are reported. So, obviously, this equation number 1 does not talk about the economic value at all. Even if we mathematically apply with an example like this, where the number is so low for a large period, you are bound to take an average value. If you do that, I get a picture which gives me a wrong convention about the whole risk picture involved in the offshore industry. You understand? This is actually the problem. So, this particular understanding of risk does not lead to the real understanding of risk picture at all. So, risk assessment cannot be based only on statistical average of probability of occurrence and consequences in terms of fatality. It should also touch upon the economic value resulting from this accident, which is not there. Consequences should include the economic value. It means I should find out this particular number somewhere in terms of $1 billion, etc. In addition to fatality also, this is also important. I am not ignoring that this is not important. What I am trying to emphasize is this particular understanding of risk equation does not give me a clear picture about the economical value associated to risk. That is the whole issue here, which is important in offshore industry, because offshore industry is spinning around the economics of the entire nation. Risk, therefore, should convert an experience into a mathematical term by attaching the consequences of the occurred events and the economic loss associated with these events. So, we have got two things here. One is the consequences of the occurred events and then the economic loss. Now, there are some keywords here. Please understand, risk therefore is a post evaluation technique, my dear friends. It is a post evaluation of any event. Then what do you actually mean by risk prevention? What do you mean by this? Preventive measures are based on understanding of or diagnosing or post evaluation of occurring events. So, for example, if no accidents have been reported at all, you cannot estimate risk. Wherever there are problems with the ensemble or the data size, statistical tools should be carefully used. I mean, we all know this as engineers and mathematicians. Wherever there is a problem associated with the data size, you have to use the statistical tools very carefully to converge into a meaningful statement. So, in the whole discussion, the meaningful statement so called is what is risk. So, therefore, to understand risk, if you are only a statistician or mathematician, it is not sufficient. You have got to feel it. You have to experience it. That is why I said risk should convert the experience, not the knowledge. You can always seek the knowledge, gain the knowledge by reading text, understanding them, simulating them, numerically modeling them, all are fine. What experience? So, you should be trained to be associated with risk aversion, risk prevention, post evaluation of risk, etc. Therefore, HSC training and practice does not stop only with the knowledge imparting to people about the accidents, also to make them to understand how will you evaluate them, to associate the loss economically caused by the incidents. So, therefore, it is an experience, very, very important. Okay? That is what we said in Srinivas and Kiran, 2014A. So, risk is a larger picture, my dear friends. It cannot be converged to a specific point, talking about only a mathematical average. Just get the data, find out the occurrence number of years, because frequency or probability of occurrence is related to the number of occurrence of events over a spread of time. If the number of occurrence of events over a large spread of time is number is very low, you will always get very sample or the sample data problem in the statistical analysis. Therefore, it can give you a wrong picture, as it has been seen in this example. It can give you a wrong understanding of risk, whereas risk is something different than being projected by this statement here. But please understand very clearly here, risk is not only about loss of life. That is what we want to emphasize. Therefore, risk should cover property, damage to environment, all issues including fatalities or loss of life or human being on board. So, that is one part of risk assessment, but that is not the only, and that does not end there. Once we say this, let us talk about how do we compare risk and safety, because that is important. One need to understand this, because the moment I say the environment or the location or the onboard training is unsafe, it means I am giving a hint about the risk involved in that whole activity. So, risk and safety should be connected. Let us see how they are connected. Safety and risk are actually contemporary. Safety is a subjective term, while risk is an abstract term. Safety cannot be quantified directly. It is addressed indirectly through risk assessment. So, risk assessment will lead to safety assurance or safety evaluation. So, somebody says I am going to evaluate safety of the whole system, it means he is actually doing risk assessment of the system. Having said this, risk assessment can be classified into two. As expected by you all, as you have been anticipating this definition, risk can be classified broadly into two. One is about the individual risk, other is about the societal risk. Individual risk is actually defined as frequency at which an individual may be expected to sustain a given level of harmness. From realization of hazard. Let us see the keywords in the definition. Individual is a term related to single person, maybe group of people who are directly connected. Individuals are those who are directly connected, or one can say associated with the hazard. For example, people working on board, drilling engineers, mechanical engineers, turbo generator operators, etc., who are working on board in drilling platform, who are working on processing platform, who are directly connected in the process and production, we call them as individuals. What is the risk they are associated with? It is an individual who expects to sustain, who is expected to sustain a given level of harmness. So, therefore, got to predefine the given level of harmness. In a given work environment, you must say what is the acceptable level of harmness, what is unacceptable level of harmness. You have got to predefine this. You cannot say whether the harmness is acceptable or not after the harmness has been realized. So, every process industry, especially in offshore industry, all these cases are exactly predefined, my dear students. It is very clear. You have got to predefine for every chemical what is the acceptable level of harmness, what is the threshold value beyond which a human being or individual cannot sustain, who is directly associated with that process. I am not talking about the indirect people at all. Okay, I will come to that later. So, you are directly involved in the process. How much can you sustain? For example, you are involved in hydrocarbon production, methane is leaking, CH4 is leaking. What is the dosage or threshold value you can sustain for how many minutes when you are continuously exposed? That is actually the level of risk. So, if you read that with the knowledge, it is the frequency at which an individual may be expected to sustain a given level of harmness when the hazard is realized. It means hazard has become a risk now. Hazard is a scenario, it is a situation, it is an environmental condition, it is a working arena. All environmental conditions, all working arenas do not cause any harm to people at all, unless otherwise the hazardous situation present in that arena is realized to become a risk. But always there is a probability that hazardous situations can become a reality and can cause risk to the post threat of risk to the situation. That is true, but the statement is not reversed. So, it is always better to assess risks, not the hazards. The moment I say hazard analysis, I cannot do it quantitatively, I can only do it qualitatively, because there is no realization, there is no number, there is no picture, there is no data. Therefore, I cannot do it mathematically, I cannot do it using statistical tools. You understand? Hazard is a qualitative assessment. Realization of hazard is a realistic assessment, which we call as risk in offshore industry. Therefore, if an individual who is directly connected to the process industry, if we want to quantify the frequency at which he is expected to sustain a given level of harmness, that is an acceptable level of harmness, then we call it individual risk. This accounts for risk of death usually. So, we can predefine this statement. Frequency at which an individual is unable to sustain a threshold value of harmness caused by an exposure resulted in fatal end. Okay? So, it usually accounts for risk of death expressed in terms of FAR, whereas FAR stands for fatality accident rate. So, the average individual risk why I am saying average? Because when the number of events are accounted for a large period, then I have to average this. Is actually the number of fatalities divided by the number of people at risk. Let us say this equation. Interestingly, let us try to pay attention to the numerator and denominator of this equation. The average individual risk accounts for the number of people who are involved, who are at risk. It means they are directly connected and associated with the hazard situation. So, people working on industry, out of which how many people die, how many people are injured, how many people are suffering from lung infection, they are not counted in the whole mathematics. Unless and until you die, you cannot be in the numerator. But if you are an employee, you can be in the denominator. Obviously, when people are not declared to be dead because the consequence of the accident, the numerator will be lower and lower. So, this will give me a picture saying that the average individual risk is lower. Obviously, it does not look for the economic perspective still. So, this may not be, or FIR may not be the correct way of understanding risk, because it is only talking about the fatality accident rate. The moment I say rate, it is always divided over a period of years. So, when you look at the population over a period of years and also look at the fatalities over the period of years, you will see average individual risk per year will be different from that of average individual risk for the past 10 years will be further lower, because the number of fatalities may be same every year, but the number of people involved will be more and more. Now, how does it compare with the societal risk? In society, the number of fatalities may be higher or lower, but the denominator is phenomenally large, because those are people who are not directly connected with the risk. The societal risk then should be defined as a relationship between the number of people suffering a given level of harmness and the frequency of that kind of harmness. Please understand, here the people refers to those who are not directly connected with the hazard, that is why we say it is societal, it is individual. Please do not get confused, individual is also part of the society. No, here the individual means people working in the industry who are responsible for realization of hazard. As I said, as we all now agree at least, risk will occur only when there is human negligence. So, therefore, these people are responsible for realization of hazard, which has formed risk. Therefore, what is their risk? So, individuals are not part of the society, they are not individuals because they are independent. No, they are employees of the company, which actually results in realization of hazards. Whereas societal people are living around in the vicinity where there is a gas leak occurred, the gas dispersed in the environment, as we saw in the first module, the different mathematical models available. So, they realize some suffocation, they realize certain lung injury, etc. So, people suffering from the harmness. It is not talking about again the direct connection to the event. Generally, this is expressed. Societal risk is expressed in terms of FN curves, where F stands for the frequency and N stands for the number of fatalities. It can also be expressed in terms of annual fatality rate in such cases. The frequency of occurrence of the event and the fatality data will be combined into a single convenient measure. Of the Z group. The Z group here is a society. So, there are two different ways of explaining risk: individual directly involved, society indirectly involved. There is one commonness between these two. Please understand what is the commonness between these two. Whenever I talk about risk so far, classically, mathematically, statistically. It is always bothered only about the fatality. It is not bothered about the people who are actually let us say become blind, having some lung infection, having some throat infection, having some loss of eye, limb, etc. They are not counted in the numerator at all or in the F1 curves. So, unless otherwise you report fatality, risk is not influenced by your statistical measure. So, I think, and you also have to agree with the statement, that is not giving me a real picture, because it does not talk anything about the economical loss, which is a very serious consequence as seen from the case studies and the previous lecture modules, etc., that economically the hazard situation can affect a serious or cause a serious damage not only to the society, but to the whole environment. So, where that is being accounted here mathematically when you use a statistical tool, as we saw in equation 1 and equation 2 subsequently. Okay. So, there is something missing in the whole understanding of risk assessment as applicable to oil and gas industries. Therefore, it becomes important to quantify risk, because risk estimates are attractive only when the consequences in economical terms are associated with this. But unfortunately, if you look at the consequences, they still remain as a statistical number. But one will be seriously interested to know the estimate of the loss, because risk leads to financial implications which arise from these consequences, which should be reflected in the company's balance sheet. So, friends, in this lecture we try to understand how risk picture can be quantified in terms of individual and societal. What are different factors which can account for risk assessment? What are different rules and regulations in international agencies which prescribes and defines risk? Why the risk picture as understood today in this given definition have ambiguity, because there is no economic loss mentioned or covered in the whole system. So, there should be some method by which we should encounter or include the economic loss, which is a very serious consequence occurring because of realization of hazard, which should be a part of risk assessment, which we will see in the subsequent lectures. Thank you very much and bye.